I'm Dr. Joseph MT, Department of Sociology, University of Mumbai. This is E-Pathshala project on religion and society, Module 4. This module is titled about the interrelationship between religious studies and social sciences with specific reference to India. Now, in this module, we look at the interface of religious studies and social sciences. Religious studies flourished as an independent discipline in the West, with a lot of theorizing and empirical and conceptual studies having gone into this. But in India, religious studies has not evolved with that kind of strength. And in this module, we look at the possible reasons behind this. And at the same time, we look at the contemporary scenario in which the kind of studies done in the social sciences can have a bearing on religious studies. And therefore, we are looking at in this module this entire gamut of relationship between social sciences, literature and religious studies with certain kind of a viewpoint. And the viewpoints that we are using, or the perspectives that we are using in this, are three. The first one is the Orientalist discourse. The second is the subaltern discourse. And the third one, which is connected to the subaltern discourse, is the post-colonial discourse. Now, using the prism of all these three discourses, we look at the way that social sciences can contribute towards a better understanding of religions in the South Asian context. And this is what we will explain and we will understand in detail in this module. Module 4, Religious Studies and the Social Sciences, the development of a problematic relationship, some comparisons of development in the West and in India. Development of religious studies in the West. Ever since the 16th century, the religious-secular dichotomy has played an ideological function in the colonial project. Religion was separated from other domains such as politics, social science, and economics, and this divide between the religious and the secular thinking has assumed the status of a static binary. This promotes an essential distinction between domains such as politics, human interference, and social science as secular and non-religious, and religion as non-political. The implication was that religion is essentially non-political and that politics is essentially non-religious. A common hesitation seen in scholarly discourses worldwide is that of assuming that religion and politics as distinct, mutually exclusive categories in the modern time. For example, Adam Smith and David Hume contributed heavily to the idea of secularization, in other words, the naturalization of the emerging ideological configuration of non-religious secular, which constructed non-religious political economy and generic religion. Berger strongly asserts that religion has not died. On the contrary, it has not only survived but flourished across the world. The resurgence of religion has an impact on the political life of all countries across the world. From the early 1990s, the so-called global resurgence of religion has inspired scholars to re-examine the relationship between the religious and the secular in the modern world. A new methodology based on a historical and ethnographic deconstruction of the categories of the religious and the secular and the divide between them aims to expose how, in the modern and colonial era, these categories have been imposed on non-Western cultures and how, in the course of this process, they gradually assumed the form they have today. In other words, the category and the dichotomy have a specific history and function in the Western culture. It presents his critical deconstruction of religion as a powerful discourse and its binary relation to secular categories like politics and economics. He says that the assumption of an essential difference between the religious and the secular is embedded in the writing, perhaps the majority of scholars in religious studies, and even more wide. Religion is not a standalone category. He argues religions are modern inventions which are made to appear ubiquitous and by being removed to a marginal privatized domain serve to mystify the supposed natural rationality of the secular state and capital. The theoretical claim he makes is that religion cannot be treated as a category in isolation but must be analyzed in its historical emergence as part of a network of categories, private and public, inner and outer. He furthers his point by saying that there are many beliefs and practices in Western cultures normally categorized as secular but which can equally be labeled religious. He has given the example of nationalism, which is according to him a kind of worship of a transcendental imaginary entity that undercuts the supposed distinctions between religion and the secular state. According to him, the historical role of the category of religion in developing the dominant ideology of the modern West has been used in a way that has not only added nothing to, but has actually obscured the subject matter it was supposed to eliminate, and this term has typically been more of a hindrance than a help in the study of culture, tradition of a society. The merit of this approach lies in its genuine attempt to take seriously non-Western cultures and their experience of social reality, which challenge the common sense view of the modern West in the embodiment of a universal and secular way of being, as opposed to many religious ways that limit the non-Western societies. This approach also instigates two central issues, which are how the categories of religion and the secular were shaped by these colonial encounters, and how this impacted upon the self-understanding of non-Western cultures. The history of the term religion and of the field of religious studies is inextricably bounded with the development of a liberal ecumenical theology, which required to seek historically to free itself from distinctively Christian terminologies and symbolisms, contrasting binary relations with one secular and the field of religious studies as an ostensibly scientific and tradition-neutral exploration of this phenomenon of religion. Contemporary religious studies and histories, meanwhile, started looking at the categories without which we could not think of religion in the modern sense at all, such as the secular as the non-religious in various constructions like secular nation-state, secular politics and law, economics and markets, scientific neutralism, materialism, and so on. As Talal Asad argues, the secular cannot be viewed as a successor to religion or be seen on the side of the rational. It is a category with multi-layered history related to major premises of modernity, democracy, and the concept of human rights. The religious and the secular are mutually delimiting and defining concepts, the distinction between them continually shifting depending on the context of a particular society. According to him, in creating its characteristic division between secular public space and religious private space, European secularism sought to shuffle ritual and discipline into the private realm. In doing so, however, it loses touch with the ways in which embodied practices of conduct help to constitute culture, including European culture. Hence, secularism should not merely be the division between public and private realms, which prevents harshly the allowance of religious diversity to flourish in the public arena. Religious studies and the social sciences in India. In India, religious studies has yet to develop in the same way as its counterpart in the West. It is to be found in a fragmentary manner in the departments of philosophy, ancient Indian history and culture, Sanskrit, and so on. Why is there such indifference in independent India towards the study of various religions of India and the world? Edward Said launched his critique of the West by planting the idea that Western notions of the East and the ways in which Orientalist discourse was disseminated legitimized colonial aggression and political supremacy of the Western world. Sheldon Pollock and Richard King have furthered this argument by saying that the authoritative power of Orientalist discourse is always associated with an imperial agenda to create a powerful Oriental narrative, which suggests that indigenous people of the East have also manipulated and constructed their own positive responses to colonialism using Orientalist conceptions. Orientalist presuppositions about the spirituality of India, etc., were used by the reformers such as Ram Mohan Roy, Dayanand Saraswati, Swami Vivekananda, and Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi in the development of the anti-colonial Hindu nationalism. In short, Hindu intelligentsia were themselves influenced by the stereotypical portrayal of the Orient carried out by the West. The Europeanization of the Orient, which claimed culturally and politically neutral goals and underlying values, however, their methods presuppose the supremacy of the European cultural project, which slides almost imperceptibly into the utilitarian Victorian enterprise of improving the natives to give them their own laws to purify the Indian culture and speak on its behalf. This eventually formed a class of potential interpreters between the colonizers and the millions of the colonized, a class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. The Western terminologies and logic in social sciences, anthropology as a science, were habituated in treating the non-European races as primitive and inferior. This attitude has marred most Western approaches to the anthropology of religions. Some of the Chicago school thinkers like David Koff in overstressing the anthropological and the magical elements in the study of religions or non-Western, non-European regions showed tendencies to religions as savages, religions of the savages as inferior. In India, British colonial ideology through the various media of communication, education and institutional control has made a substantial contribution to the construction of modern religious and nationalist identities and self-awareness amongst contemporary Indians. The modernist concept of the distinguishing religious and secular within Indian culture and history prevail, and contemporary Indian identities remain subject to the influence of a westernizing and neo-colonial Orientalism or utilitarianism. Along with Rajiv Bhargav, T.N. Madan, Shishnandi viewed this political secularism carrying inevitably the heavy baggage of a larger, comprehensive, hyper-substantive secular worldview. According to them, secularism in India is part of a larger modernist project. Secularism, according to them, constitutes an entire worldview that establishes a hierarchical relation between the secular and the religious, which in its political form expels religion from the public life. In a multi-religious society like India, secularism may not be restricted to rationalism, that it is incompatible with faith, and that rationalism as understood in the Victorian and post-Enlightenment faith in the progressive nature of history is not sole motive force of a concept of a modern state. India and the subcontinents have different religious sects instead of one uniform religion per se. All religions in turn, including Hinduism, have different sects. Hindu philosophers in India are associated with various religious groups and sects. In Buddhism, there are sects like Mahayana, Hinayana, Vajrayana, or the Diamond Vehicle. In Islam, sects such as Ahmadiyya, Ismaili, Salafi, Shia, Sufi, Sunni, Nizari, Islami, Ismailis, Wahhabism also exist. In India, religious belief as faith was a way of life, philosophy a tradition which is definitionally non-monolithic and operationally plural, and religious conviction as ideology is a subnational, national or cross-national identifier of populations contesting for or protecting non-religious, usually political or socio-economic interests. Modernization process in India made easy to recognize other communities on the basis of religion, such as Muslims and Christians, also produced political consequences of the construction of a common consolidated Hindu identity, produced religionist ideology in Gramscian terms. A class community which wishes to become hegemonic has to nationalize itself in the processes, create a nationalist middle class, and then generated secularism to meet its challenge to the ideology of modern statecraft. In contrast, in India, religiousness being of the immense importance, public-private distinctions failed to hold, and religiousness inevitably entered public life through communalization of politics. Nevertheless, secularism without religiousness proves virtually inconsistent in India, because the established hierarchy in Indian culture encompasses the secular within the religious, and because it is too much of a public matter to be privatized. The demand for the removal of religiosity from public life in India is predicated within the secular framework upon the mainstream Enlightenment view of religion. This view of secularism proved an inappropriate ground for meeting the challenge of Hindu majoritarianism in India. Secularism, in the sense of a strict separation between the modern state and traditional religion, proves sometimes unsuitable in the Indian context for the defense of minorities, because the majority religion sometimes used the separation in maneuvering the vast machinery of the state to discriminate against minorities. On the flip side, strict neutrality and non-preferentialism in the historical reality of Indian situation has sometimes slipped from being practiced. The Indian state has intervened selectively in the personal laws of majoritarian religious communities and has not been strictly secular in this sense. As well, in the context of caste system in India, the separation between religion and politics became unmanageable, which indicate the separation between religion and social science as unreasonable. The understanding of caste as a religious system as intrinsically connected to Hinduism came into being only as late as 1820s. Will Sweetman shows in his study that the British classification of caste as a religious rather than a political institution was an instrument of colonial policy designed to strengthen Brahmin caste eventually. Caste is now believed to be extremely rigid, determined by birth and characterized by untouchability, where purity and impurity and pollution play a crucial role. However, caste in India is no more a static phenomenon and is characterized by mobility. European colonial influence upon Indian religion and culture has profoundly altered its nature in the modern era. Western colonization has contributed to the modern construction of Hinduism by locating the core of Indian religiosity through the textualization of cultures, and also by the tendency to define Indian religious convictions in terms of a normative definition of religion based upon contemporary Western understanding of Judeo-Christian traditions. Scope of studies on religion associated with the social sciences in India. The arbitrariness involved in the homogenization of Indian religious belief and philosophy under the rubric of Hinduism, and the same a priori assumption of religious unity of Judaism, Christianity and Islam. Von Steitenkron argues that these religious sects or denominations of a single religiosity, despite having a common geographical origin in the Near East, a common ancestry, a common monotheism, prophetism, accepting a linear and eschatological conception of history, similar religious ethics, similar theological framework, there is no common founder of the three movements, no uniformed religious ritual, ecclesiastical clergy organization, and no common doctrine which is valid for all its adherents. If we then consider the diversity of religious movements generally subsumed under the label of Hinduism, we will find that Hinduism is in effect a pan-Indian category that subsumes under its fold a vast variety of sects and religious traditions. These religious traditions not only display a hierarchy of high-low gods, but also differentiation in terms of major and minor traditions within the different regions where these traditions hold sway. Edward Said has suggested that such an abstract and synchronic approach with Orientalist discourses fundamentally distinguish the passive and historical Orient from the active and the historically changing Occident. This new Hinduism, that is syndicated Hinduism, furnished with a Brahmanical base, merged with elements of upper caste belief and ritual with one eye on the Christian and Islamic models, which was thoroughly infused with a political and nationalist emphasis to search for national identity, consciousness and national union. The perceived shortcomings of contemporary Hinduism in a utilitarian concept created the belief that Hindu religious conviction has stagnated over the centuries and was therefore in need of reformation. In result, the rise of Hindu reform movements in the 19th century filled with the Brahmo Samaj, the Arya Samaj and the Ramakrishna Mission. Almost all the academic textbooks describe these groups as reform movements, which falls into the trap of seeing the pre-colonial religious convictions through colonial spectacles. The highly questionable periodization of ancient Indian history by the utilitarian school gave the impression that Hinduism is a single religion with its origins in the Vedas, and from medieval period onwards, Hinduism stagnated and lost its potential for renewal enlargement. Hence, with the arrival of the West, Hindus became inspired to reform their decadent religion to its former glory. Thus, Hinduism in the 20th century is allowed to enter the privileged arena of the world religions, the criteria of membership established by the West. The religious studies in India being part of the social science would make it possible to question, rethink, historically reconstruct, rewrite the historiography of the construction of modern nation-state, which was a product of European political and economic developments from the 16th century onwards, and the introduction of the nationalist model into Asia as a further legacy of European imperialism in this area. The profound scope of religious studies in the social science in India would abandon the essentialism rather than facilitating vagueness and disorder, opens up the possibility of new directions in the study of South Asian religion and culture. Through this, a proper acknowledgement of the heterogeneity of Indian religiosity would critique the homogenizing and hegemonic discourse provided by the post-colonial world, also would allow for the possibility of subaltern responses in agreement to the dominant ideological constructs and the cultural and political elitism.
In this module, we have extensively looked at the way that religious studies flourished in the West as a discipline. Then we looked at the lack of such flourishing in India. And in the third part, we looked at some ways in which the grand theorizing in the social sciences that is happening in India can actually help us understand religions better. And this is what we have looked at in this module. Thank you.